We've looked at the Westminster groups, the Old Testament, which did Genesis to Kings, had 10 translators. The New Testament Committee, which had 7 men, did Romans to Jude, the epistles, 17 men in the Westminster group. The Oxford group, 7 did the Old Testament, Isaiah to Malachi, 8 did the New Testament, the remainder of it, the Gospels, Acts, and the Apocalypse. And we are toward the end of that group, and we're on number 7. Number 7 of Oxford New Testament group. And the man's name was Henry Saville, S-A-V-I-L-E, Henry Saville. He was born in 1549. He died in 1622, which made him 55 at the time of the translation. He was a Mr. and Provost at Eton College, E-A-T-O-N. Mr. Saville has the distinction of generally being thought of as the most handsome of all of the translators, if that is a distinction worthy to be noted. But before any of you ladies start to drool, remember that beauty in that age consisted of ample flesh. It was not the sleek, muscular cougar look of America in the 1980s. You were handsome if you had many chins and a large belly. So and a pretty boy face, which he had. So that's what he's known as. The most handsome of all of these almost 60 translators. He traveled through Europe during his life, and he was able to collect many rare Greek manuscripts. And such a trip and a collection were helpful, of course, for his translating work, because he's on the New Testament team. He tutored Queen Elizabeth in Greek, as well as math. Was very good with gardens and orchards, so he was not only an inside person. As a teacher, however, he was not very easy to work under. His students hated him because he was so difficult and so cruel. He was knighted by King James on 21 September 1604. So the fall of the year in which they began the work on the KJV. But this was no great honor, since it had to be purchased with a large sum of money. But he ends up not only as Mr. Henry Saville, but as Sir Henry Saville, because he's knighted by the king. He gave an early rare copy of the Russian Gospels to the new Bodleian Library, which had just been established, part of his collection from his travels through Europe. A very rare copy of the Russian Gospels, Gospels done in Russian, that is, to the new Bodleian Library, B-O-D-L-E-I-A-N, the Bodleian Library. And he founded 2 professorships at Oxford. Although he was a provost at Eton, he founded 2 professorships. That's like establishing a teaching chair. One in geometry and the other in astronomy. No surprise, since he was a tutor of math to Elizabeth I. Geometry and astronomy. Besides being known as the most handsome of the translators, he was also known as the editor of the works of the church writer Chrysostom in 8 volumes. He spent much of his life even while working on the KJV, editing the works of Chrysostom. And he did this along with Boyce and Downes, two other translators that I don't think we've come to yet. Boyce, B-O-I-S, and Downes, D-O-W-N-E-S. These two men help him editing the works of Chrysostom in 8 volumes. It was a monumental work that he did. So he was a scholar in the early Greek church fathers as well. And that work of his exists down to today in other editions of Chrysostom. People have built upon the edition of Henry Saville. But since he's doing the KJV, and he's also working on the writings of Chrysostom, then he's extremely, extremely busy. He is one of the few men who happens to be married at the time. And his wife greatly complained about the time he spent away from home doing the KJV, and especially the time he spent working on Chrysostom. And I have a quote from his wife. She said, "I wish I were a book." My wife probably feels that way sometimes. You didn't let me finish what she said. That's a good thing to desire to be. A hammer or a paintbrush or a book. She said, "I wish I were a book, then you would a little more respect me." He printed the works from 1610 to 1613, the very end of the KJV time. On his own press, with his own money, which cost him £8,000, it was a fortune, with type that was imported from Holland. He printed the works of Chrysostom. This will become interesting to you later on. If you were ever able to study some of the early church writers, we start talking about Chrysostom. We know about his early Greek writings, but we don't read his Greek, we want it in English. And so now we'll know the one to whom we're indebted for the English giving of the works of Chrysostom. He printed it from 1610 to 13 on his own press, with his own money, £8,000, with type that was imported from Holland. And he lives 11 years after the printing of the KJV. Number 7, Henry Saville. Then finally, in this New Testament group at Oxford, which did Gospels, Acts, and the Apocalypse, number 8, Giles Thompson. No H in Thompson. Giles Thompson. G-I-L-E-S, just like it sounds. Giles Thompson. He died in the year the KJV was printed, 1611. He was Doctor and Dean of Windsor. Now he's our second Thompson. You probably won't remember, but he's our second Thompson thus far. However, the two Thompsons are not related. The first Thompson was Westminster Old Testament group. He was the drunken Dutchman. Now you may remember him. The Arminian drunken Dutchman. This Thompson, Oxford New Testament group. Giles Thompson had been a student with, not of, but with Lancelot Andrewes. And in the year that he died, 1611, he was made Bishop of Gloucester, which he did not get to enjoy very long. So, in this group that did everything but the epistles in the New Testament, we don't have that many important men. We don't really have any that are important. The two that would stand out above any of the others would be the first one we discussed, Abbott, A-B-B-O-T. He's the one who shot the arrow that glanced off the tree and accidentally killed another man while deer hunting. Abbott and Henry Saville. Those would be the two that would stand out above the other 6 men. Now these 8 Oxford New Testament men, according to the British Museum list, we've seen that 2 of them were replacements. In other words, they were certainly not of that original group chosen. The second one, John Agliombi, and the 4th one, Leonard Hutton, that we've already given you. Now, if these are replacement, that means that the earlier 2 that they replaced had to either die or move away. And on other lists, it seems like we should add as many as 5 more names. So we'll add them as A, B, C, D, E, not as the official 8, but as A, B, C, D, E to these 8 Oxford New Testament men. Men that we don't know very much about at all, and men that do not seem to be that important. First of all, so number A would be Richard Edes, E-D-E-S. These are men that are not found on the British Museum's list, but they're gleaned from other sources. Dr. Dean of Worcester. He died 19 November 1604, which would probably mean he's one of these initial men that died. Although he's already into the work somewhat, from 1604 to 1607, we only have the preliminary stage anyway. So he dies 19 November 1604, and he did leave a few initial notes on his translating work in the Gospels. So he might have been replaced either by number 2, Agliombi, or number 4, Hutton, or he wasn't replaced, and these are just some other men that are added on. Then B, Ralph Ravens, R-A-V-E-N-S, Ralph Ravens. Dr. Dean of Wells, and a fellow at St. John's. It's not found on the BM list, the British Museum list. We know that he did do some translating work because we know that he died sometime after 1611. So he's certainly not one of these who died or moved away and then was replaced. He had to do something as far as the translating work was concerned, because we don't know when he died, but we know it was after the publication of the KJV. Then letter C, James Montague. He was appointed to assist this group, is all we know about him. M-O-N-T-A-G-U-E, James Montague. He was appointed to assist, so he was really not one of the actual official translators. He was just appointed in some assistant capacity. Letter D, George Rives, R-Y-V-E-S. He was perhaps one of the overseers, if that plan was ever actually put into effect, as we will see from step number 15 later on. There were various steps that were listed in the official gathering together of exactly what they were going to accomplish. And one plan, step 15, was to have overseers. Now, this is not the same as the committees we've talked about before, but overseers. And at least on one occasion, this man is mentioned in the capacity of an overseer. But in other places, it seems like that plan was never really put into effect. They never put into effect the plan of having overseers. So that'd be contradictory then for them not to put that plan into effect, step 15, and for this man to be referred to as an overseer. So it's another one of the question marks of the Men Behind the KJV. And then finally, under Oxford New Testament, we've given you the 8. This would be letter E, Nicholas Love, L-O-V-E. I don't know anything about this man. I don't know what role he played with his group. Nicholas Love. Then let's get going on our third leg. That would be with Cambridge, which did the Old Testament and the Apocrypha. The Old Testament had 8 men, and they did what's left in the Old Testament, 1 Chronicles through the Song of Solomon. So all of the wisdom and poetic section of the Old Testament, as well as some other things, historical books of Chronicles. 1 Chronicles through the Song of Solomon. 7 men on the Apocrypha Committee, which did all of the Apocrypha, for 15 total men. Okay, let's start with the 8 men under Cambridge Old Testament group. I should have probably written up here for you what each group did, so you'll remember that. But here we're talking about wisdom poetic literature of the Old Testament, 1 Chronicles through the Song of Solomon. Number 1, Roger Andrews. Roger Andrews. Andrews. He was a master at Jesus College, and brother of the much more famous Lancelot Andrews. So, we have the only relatives working together on the committee. The Thompsons were not relatives. We have 2 Thompsons. The Andrews were. Lancelot Andrews, much more famous than his brother Roger Andrews. Back a few years ago in 1981, Baker Bookhouse put out in a little paperback edition, something I mentioned to you a while back, the devotions of Lancelot Andrews. And by the way, there's a picture of Lancelot Andrews. And since I neglected to bring it then, and I'm talking about his brother now, I thought I'd bring it and show you a picture of the older brother, Lancelot Andrews, and read a devotion or 2 out of his to show you what they were like during this day, what he thought. It's a, thick book, 200 pages of devotions. Morning devotions, basically morning devotions and evening devotions. And you have a little biography a 30-page biography attached onto the beginning of this. Morning prayers, evening prayers, and then various meditations and prayers for various times and seasons. A Hosanna in the highest, an act of pleading, an act of confession, a confession of faith, a prayer for grace, an act of intercession, an act of thanksgiving, a meditation on the aggravation of sin, a meditation on the day of judgment, a meditation on the shortness of life, an act of thanksgiving for the Lord's Day. What I've selected concerns communion prayers and meditations. And this one is entitled An Act of Self-Examination Before the Lord's Supper. I found the book to be very beautiful in his thoughts here. Here, in other words, would be some of the thoughts that would go through his mind as he would prepare himself for what he called the Lord's Supper, communion. It's a long series of questions, of contrasting how far someone else has gone, as you'll see here in the Old and the New Testament, and how far has he gone? Is he really ready to partake of communion? Have I penitence, grief, shame, pain, horror, weariness for my sin? Do I pray, if not 7 times as David, at least thrice as Daniel? If not as Solomon at length, yet shortly as the publican? If not like Christ the whole night, then do I do it for at least 1 hour? If not on the ground and in ashes, at least not in my bed? If not in sackcloth, at least not in purple and fine linen? If not altogether freed from all, at least from immoderate desires? Do I give, if not as Zacchaeus 4-fold, at least as the law commands, with the 5th part added? If not as the rich, yet as the widow? If not the half, yet the 30th part? If not above my power, yet up to my power? Is that interesting? Take himself through these steps of meditation. Now, if I don't give at least as much as Zacchaeus, or if I don't pray at least as much as David did 7 times, do I do it as much as Daniel 3 times? And if I can't pray the whole night like Christ did, do I excuse that and say I shouldn't pray at all? If I don't pray that much, do I not at least pray an hour a day? So if I can't pray on the ground and in ashes, can I at least get out of my bed to pray? An act of consecration and humiliation before the Lord. And then the next one is called an act of prayer before the Lord's Supper. That was my favorite one, that first one that I read, an act of self-examination before the communion. Lord, I am not worthy, I am not fit, that thou shouldest come under the defiled roof of my soul. For it is all desolate and ruined, nor hast thou in me a fitting place to lay thy precious head. But as thou didst condescend to lie in a cavern and manger brute cattle, as thou didst not refuse to be entertained in the house of Simon the leper, as thou didst not disdain the harlot, a sinner like me, when she came to thee and touched thee, as thou abhorrest not her polluted and loathsome mouth, nor the thief upon the cross confessing thee, so even me, the ruined, wretched, and excessive sinner, deign to receive to the touch and the partaking of the immaculate, supernatural, life-giving, and saving mysteries of thy all-holy body and thy precious blood. Listen, O Lord our God, from thy holy habitation, and from the glorious throne of thy kingdom, and come to satisfy us. O thou who sittest on high with the Father, and art present with us here invisibly, come thou to sanctify the gifts which lie before thee, and those in whose behalf, and by whom, and the things for which they are brought near thee, and grant to us communion unto faith without shame, love unfeigned, fulfillment of thy commandments, readiness to bring forth every spiritual fruit, deliverance from all that is adverse, healing of soul and body, that we too, with all saints since the world began, who have been well-pleasing to thee, may become partakers of thy undefiled and everlasting goods, which thou hast prepared, O Lord, for them that love thee, in whom thou art glorified forever and ever. O Lamb of God, which takest away the sin of the world, take away the sin of me, the utter sinner. And another short one that was to be read after communion. Fulfilled and finished so far as in thy power, O Christ our God, is the mystery of thy dispensation. For we have held remembrance of thy death. We have seen the figure of thy resurrection. We have been filled with thy endless life. We have enjoyed thy uncloying dainties, of which graciously vouchsafe unto all of us to be accounted worthy also in the world to come. The good Lord pardon every one that prepareth his heart to seek God, the Lord God of his fathers, though he be not cleansed according to the purification of the sanctuary. Well, I'm tempted to find another good one in here. Let's see what 2:18 reads like. I had already read those. I'm not familiar with this one. Well, this is a good one, though, I believe. It's entitled A Meditation on the Aggravation of Sin. Its measure, its harm, its scandal, its quality, its iteration, how often, its continuation, how long, the person by whom, his age, condition, state, enlightenment, its manner, its motive, its time, its place, its folly, its ingratitude, its hardness, its contempt. The various kinds of sin, the cord and the cart rope, in necessary things, in things superfluous, omission or defect, the not doing what ought to be done, commission or excess, the doing what ought not to be done, by heart within, in thought, by mouth without, in word, by deed without, in fact, against God, against my neighbor, against my own body, by knowledge and by ignorance, willingly and unwillingly, of old and of late, in boyhood and youth, in mature and old age, things done once, things repeated often, hidden and open, things done in anger, or from the lust of the flesh, or from the lust of the world, before and after my call, asleep by night and awake by day, things concerning myself alone and things connected with others, things remembered and things forgotten. Whatsoever I have done amiss from my youth till now, till this moment, knowingly or ignorantly, within or without, asleep or awake, by words, deeds, or thoughts, through the fiery darts of the enemy, through the unclean desires of the flesh, have mercy on me, O God, and forgive me. He covers all areas of all types of sins. You ready for one more?
Amen.
We're getting our spiritual part of Biblical Lit now. A meditation on the day of judgment. Father unoriginate, only begotten Son, life-giving Spirit, merciful, compassionate, long-suffering, full of pity and full of tender yearnings, who lovest the just and pitiest the sinful, who passest by sins and grantest petitions, God of penitence, Savior of sinners, I have sinned before thee, O Lord, and thus have I done. Alas, alas, woe, woe, how I was enticed by my own lust, how I hated instruction, nor felt I fear nor awe of thy incomprehensible glory, thy dread presence, thy terrible power, thy strict justice, thy winning goodness. I will call if there be any that will answer me. To which of the holy angels shall I turn? O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? How fearful is thy judgment, O Lord, when the thrones are set, and the angels in presence, and the men are brought, and the books are opened, and the works inquired into, the thoughts examined, and the hidden things of darkness. What judgment shall be upon me? Who shall quench my flame? Who shall lighten my darkness, if thou pity me not? Lord, as thou art the lover of men, give me tears, give me floods, give them today. For then will the incorruptible judge, the awful judgment seat, the answer without excuse, the inevitable charges, the bitter punishment, the endless Gehenna, the pitiless angels, the yawning hell, the roaring stream of fire unquenchable, the dark prison, the rayless darkness, the bed of live coals, the unwearied worm, the indissoluble chains, the immeasurable gulf, the impassable wall, the inconsolable cry. None to stand by me, none to plead for me, none to snatch me out. But I repent, Lord, O Lord, I repent. Help thou mine impenitence, and more and still more, pierce, rend, and crush my heart. Behold, O Lord, that I am indignant with myself for my senseless, profitless, hurtful, perilous passions, for which I abhor myself, for the inordinate, unseemly, deformed, deceitful, shameful, disgraceful thing that is in me, that my confusion is continually before me, and the shame of my face hath covered me. Alas, woe, woe, O me, how long? Behold, Lord, that I judge myself worthy of everlasting punishment, yea, and of all miseries of this world. Behold me, Lord, self-condemned. Behold, Lord, and enter not into judgment with thy servant. And now, Lord, I humble myself under thy mighty hand. I bow my knees unto thee, O Lord. I fall on my face to the earth. Let this cup pass from me. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. I smite upon my breast, upon my thigh. Out of the depths my soul crieth unto thee, as in a thirsty land. And all my bones and all that is within me, Lord, hear my voice. It's a beautiful little book to meditate on. Pick it up, and you'll find a lot of that in the Psalms as well, but it's a beautiful little book to show you how someone else meditates on their wretchedness, comparatively speaking, their wretchedness this side of God. So this comes not from Roger Andrews, but from his brother, Lancelot. Number 2, Andrew Bing, B-I-N-G, Andrew Bing, 1574 to 1652. He was 30 at the time of the translation. Mr. Professor of Hebrew at Trinity College. 30 means he was very young at the time of the work. One man was 27, Samuel Ward, I believe, but Bing was 30, which makes him certainly one of the youngest present. And he outlived nearly all the others as well. He outlived James, he outlived Charles I, the next king, and he outlived Laud, who will be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, that we probably won't get into because we'll be through with the KJV by then. But he died at the ripe old age of 78. Number 3, Lawrence Chatterton. Spelled with a U and not a W. L-A-U. Lawrence Chatterton. C-H-A-D-E-R-T-O-N. 1537. Compare that to Bing's 1574. Chatterton's one of the older ones on the group. 1537 to 1640. And compare that to Bing's 1652. He almost caught up with him. He was a Mr. and Master of Emmanuel College. You remember what we said about Chatterton before? Well, he was the other chief Puritan of the 4 Puritans with Reynolds at Hampton Court before the king. 2 other lesser-known men, and the 2 well-known ones would be John Reynolds, the father of the KJV, and the other Puritan, Lawrence Chatterton. So that's where we've mentioned him before. The other important Puritan at Hampton Court Conference. He was born into a rich Roman Catholic family, but converted at a young age to Protestantism due to some of the local lay preaching. And whenever he converted, this really moved my heart. Whenever he converted to Protestantism, his father sent him a letter, which was very brief, just contained this sentence. Son Lawrence, remember he's converted from a rich Roman Catholic family to Protestantism. Son Lawrence, if you will renounce the new sect which you have joined, you may expect all the happiness which the care of an indulgent father can assure you. Otherwise, I enclose money to buy a wallet. Go and beg. Shows you what it costs someone, and it still does some people today, but what it costs someone to leave their former church. Because his own father wrote and said, if you'll renounce this sect and come back home and join the mother church, then you can expect all of the pleasures that an indulgent father could afford to bring upon you. If not, I enclose enough money to buy a wallet. Go and beg. In other words, that's the end of it. Throw him out of the house. Well, that's exactly what he did. He went and begged until he got a little further in life, and then he became a teacher, so he didn't have to beg. But he did not go back to Roman Catholicism. He stayed with Protestantism, and more than that, he became a Puritan. He learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Italian, Spanish, and botany. The last one's not a language. Well, I guess you could call it a language of the plant world. He learned Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Italian, Spanish, he already knew English, and botany. Quite a learned man. Was a strict Calvinist and Puritan. He was known for a series of afternoon lectures that he delivered at Cambridge. Why is he known for this? Because he delivered a series of afternoon lectures every day for 50 years. Quite a commitment to a teaching ministry. Afternoon lectures at Cambridge for 50 years, non-stop, 7 days a week. I like this man, these biographical tidbits about him. I like someone like this. Father said, I enclose money to buy a wallet, go and beg. And then he went and learned all of these languages. In 1576, he had to resign a Cambridge fellowship that he held because he desired marriage. You could not be a teacher and be married, not in certain places anyway. And so he did marry. He had a very good marriage, which was rare, one which was to last him 55 years. This is unlike the marriage of John Overall, who married the prettiest woman in England, and she ran away and some of his friends caught the lovers going down a London lane. That was John Overall, back to the first group. Lawrence Chatterton could have given some instruction to some of these other men about the married life. He had to resign. I mean, he was the man constantly having to surrender something for a higher good. Surrendering a Cambridge fellowship, how does that compare with a wife that will stay with you for 55 years? And it's interesting that he was on the committee that did the Song of Solomon. Well, I like to see what I see in their life and what books they were responsible for. You know, I wouldn't want John Overall on this committee here. Or maybe half the other men who weren't even married. How could they ever do Song of Solomon? So Lawrence Chatterton probably had a good hand in the Song of Solomon. He'd be very adept at that. With a faithful wife and a good marriage that lasted you more than a half a century, then a Song of Solomon, that'd be a breeze to do. If you've conquered that many years of marriage. He was one of the older translators, as you see, 67 whenever they began the work. One of the older translators, 67, and he outlived all of the translators except two. Quite a testimony to this man. I guess the way we'd interpret that is, if you have a peaceful home, you'll live a long life then. At age 100, you notice from the years that gave that he lived to be over that, 1537 to 1640. If I didn't give those, there they are. At age 100, he could read perfectly without glasses. And that's after learning all of these languages. He died 13 November 1640 at the age of 103. November 13, 1640. Now that is just, for those days, tremendous. Life expectancy was way, way, way up back in the days of Methuselah. But as time has gone along, it's gone down, down, down. And now with modern conveniences and medical science, it's slowly going back up again. But in 1611 and 1640, you just didn't live to be 103 years old. Half of your children, and you could have been one of those whenever you were a child, were taken in infancy by some childhood disease anyway, and you survived that, and survived all the rigors of a hard life. Of course, a good wife has helped him survive all of that, and he lives to be 103 years of age. One of the oldest, and he lives the longest, outlives all of them, with the exception of two. How many children? I don't have a note of that. That's something I never discovered. Number 4, Francis Dillingham. Francis Dillingham. Reminds you of John Dillinger. Thinking of him because I'm reading J. Edgar Hoover's biography now. FBI chief for 4 decades. And he had a thing or two to say about the commies back in the 1910s and 20s, and a thing or two to say about John Dillinger. He died in 1625. I don't have his birth date. He died in 1625. Francis Dillingham, spelled just like it sounds. Mr. Fellow at Christ College. One of many who never married, but he wrote in favor of marriage for ministers. So he must have been a friend of Lawrence's then, I guess. He never married, but he didn't feel that there was something wrong with it. In other words, he would agree with what Paul said in 1 Timothy 4, that it's a doctrine of a demon to forbid marriage. Like was forbidden Chatterton, at least if he wanted to continue in the certain Cambridge fellowship. Now I have a few statements of his to read. He was not married, but he was on the same committee with Chatterton, so he had some insights to the married life. Here's what he writes. It is a principle in nature to marry with thy equals. By unequal marriages, how many men have become subject to their wives? May not men nowadays see wives on horses and husbands walking as servants on the ground? No Englishman with self-respect should ever stand for that. Well, I would probably let my wife ride and I would walk, but he has an interesting look at this. May not men nowadays see wives on horses and husbands walking as servants on the ground? Reminds me of the proverbial American male when he goes shopping with his wife at the grocery store. He's like old Goofus there following behind, really not knowing what to do, except he has the leg power to push the cart around. And she says, no, get this, get that, turn there, left, right, back, forth, up, down, grab, hurry, we got to go. And he's trying to corral all of the children as well. Oh, Dagwood is what it reminds me of. You remember Dagwood, don't you? Dagwood, Blondie, we could call them Adam and Eve, I guess. That a man may obtain a wife that will be in subjection unto him, he must choose a prudent and wise wife. For prudence and wisdom respecteth persons, place, and manner of doing a thing. In other words, she'll have proper etiquette, I guess. Prudence teacheth the wife that her husband is her head, and so subjecteth herself unto him. No marvel then, though many men have not their wives in subjection, for they have married fools which know not their place. Now listen to this. A wise woman, saith Solomon, buildeth a house, but the foolish what? Look at Proverbs 14:1. See, he's on the committee that does Proverbs. And here's one of our few references. Well, we'll have some more, I think, with Boyce later. But one of our few references thus far to a man who's quoting the Bible, putting it in English, and who actually is going to be the one responsible for working on the very book that contains the verse that he quotes, and yet they're not exactly the same, which is interesting. Doesn't it say that she plucketh it down with her hands? Isn't that the word? Yeah. Every wise woman buildeth her house, but the foolish plucketh it down with her hands. So he must have written this, before they translated the Bible. And so he had to know how he wanted to phrase this verse. And he said, a wise woman buildeth her house, but the foolish destroyeth it with her hands. So there's a slight change. They changed destroyeth to plucketh it down. He that will have a wife in subjection, let him match with a religious woman, for religion teacheth her subjection. Be not unequally yoked, saith Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14, with infidels. Well, infidels is later in the verse, but it says don't be yoked together with unbelievers there. So he wasn't responsible for New Testament epistles, and it's slightly different. A man of religion that matches with an irreligious woman is unequally matched, and therefore his yoke must needs be heavy. A house divided cannot stand. How should that house then stand where man and wife are divided, one drawing this way and another that way? The misery of this age is that men inquire after wealth and not after religion in a woman, marrying into an important family. Hence it is that some live discontentedly and come in the end to great misery. So he was not married, but he had some insights into marriage. He wrote a book entitled A Golden Key, Opening the Lock to Eternal Happiness. A Golden Key, Opening the Lock to Eternal Happiness. And the theme of the book? Husbands, keep your wives in subjection. So he must have liked to write and think and talk much about the subject of a good marriage. And some of those fellow bad translators like John Overall, should have listened to him as well. Boyce is another one with a bad marriage. Those are the two well-known ones with bad marriages, John Overall and John Boyce. And Chatterton is the one with a perfect marriage. And Billingham is the one who knows how to write about it, but he doesn't have it. He was an Anglican. Number 5, Thomas Harrison. Thomas Harrison. Born in 1555. He was a Mr. and was Vice Master, Trinity College. Vice Master, Trinity College. Puritan. At his undergraduate school, he was second in learning only to Lancelot Andrewes. He was an expert in Greek and Hebrew, especially in Greek and Hebrew idiom. You know what his contemporaries called him? They called him the poet. Thomas Harrison, number 5, the poet. What could you glean from that? Psalms. He was responsible for Psalms on that committee. Be a perfect man. That's what his contemporaries called him, the poet. He was so good with rhythm and verse and idiom that, and this is something that you probably never have heard of, no one has heard of. Who did the Psalms? Who gave us the Psalms in such a beautiful way? Perhaps this man, Thomas Harrison. At least perhaps he's most responsible, or more responsible than anyone else. Thomas Harrison, the poet among the KJV translators, giving us the Psalms. Chatterton gave us Song of Solomon, and Dillingham gave us Proverbs. Number 6, Edward Lively. Edward Lively. 1545 to 1605. Fellow at Trinity College. We discussed him earlier. What do you remember about Edward Lively? Why is that the only thing you remember about him? First of all, along with Harding and Andrews, he was one of the 3 men appointed by the king in search of translators. And then, yes, he had a wife that bore him 13 children, and then she gave up the ghost and died. And he had to provide for them, and he did so on one occasion, selling his entire library for a couple of pounds. He was chairman of this group, the Old Testament group at Cambridge. And I've told you some things earlier about him which would make him a good chairman. He was very humble, very patient, very kind, very thoughtful, very hardworking, a reliable organizer. He would have to have had all of these qualities in raising all of those children alone. Not all of them survived, but in raising those that did survive. Very good organizer, very precise mind, very good man, kind and gentle and humble. And so many of these men were arrogant and proud, and Edward Lively was not. One person has written of him, and I quote from someone else's writing, "Too earnest study and pains about the translation hastened poor Edward's death." He was meticulous. He wanted to do well. He wanted to be good in what he did. And too earnest study and pains about the translation hastened poor Edward's death. And I think I've said that the surviving relatives, the descendants of his children, now live in the United States. Number 7. You found your next child's name yet in all of these names? John Richardson. John Richardson. Don't name him either one of these names. And I'll tell you why in a minute. 1564, 1626. Mr. Master of Trinity College. Most of these, I guess you can figure out. He's 40 years old whenever they begin their work. I'll give you the birth dates. You can pretty much figure out how old they were. He was an Arminian and very very fat, and his contemporaries called him, and I quote, the fat-bellied Arminian. One was a drunken Dutchman, one was a poet, one was the third university, a living library, and this man, by his contemporaries, was referred to as the fat-bellied Arminian. So most of the men were large, so that would have meant he was huge. Number 8, last man, Robert Spalding. Robert Spalding. He died in 1626. He was Mr. and Fellow at St. John's College. Now, if Edward Lively was the chairman of the Cambridge Old Testament group, and he died in 1605, the preliminary stage of work, that would mean someone would have to succeed him. And that one was Robert Spalding. He was successor to Lively upon Lively's untimely death as the new chairman and the second of the Cambridge Old Testament group, 1 Chronicles through the Song of Solomon.